So I was browsing through Facebook Marketplace in my area and came across a listing for an old unibody 27-inch iMac for $50. I wasn't too sure about the specs, and it was an as-is 4-parts listing, but I jumped on it anyway. When I messaged the seller, he mentioned that he had two and whether I wanted both for $100. I ended up talking him down to $90, so I went to pick them up, and here they are. Neither of them have RAM or storage, so I had to use some parts I had laying around. I plugged them in and did some troubleshooting and found the following information. The one without the glass would not do anything on startup, so naturally I opened it up and found that whoever was in here last unplugged every connector and removed most of the screws. Once I connected everything back together, it booted straight into my El Capitan install. I said straight into my El Capitan install. I said straight into my El Capitan... Okay, what's going on? I swear this worked before. Maybe my install is bad? After making an installer, it worked just fine. Weird. Anyway, it turns out that this unit has an upgraded Core i7-2600 and the Radeon 6970M GPU. Even though the label on the front, put on presumably by the office that last owned this, said that it was the Core i5 model. Pretty lucky if I do say so myself. The only problem is that the frame is in pretty rough shape and I can't just throw the motherboard into the other one because the 2011s have different I/O when compared to the 2009s and 2010s, which would make it not fit properly. Speaking of which, the other one would not boot all the way into macOS. When I tried doing the keyboard commands to reset the PRAM or select a startup disk, it would just ignore me and boot straight into recovery mode. This probably had to do with the same issue that I had with the 2011 iMac earlier, because when I plugged it in again, it reset the PRAM just fine and booted right up. Although it did give me a white screen for a while, which was weird. This unit turned out to be a 2009 model with the base Core 2 Duo E7600, which is kinda disappointing. But nevertheless, I will upgrade both of these units to reach their maximum, well, within reason, capabilities. So, what upgrades do I plan to do in this video series? Well, these iMacs have MXM slots on their motherboards. MXM is a mostly dead standard that essentially functions as a regular PCIe slot. They were mostly used in gaming laptops with upgradable graphics cards. This Mac Rumors thread, linked in the description, contains all the information you need to know about what cards are supported and what extra stuff you have to do in order to get them working. I plan on installing newer AMD GPUs as the Nvidia ones can be pretty poor value. More on that later. Deciding what card to use was pretty simple. According to the thread, the GCN version 1 to 3 GPUs are not compatible with the 2011 models, so they would be a perfect fit for the 2009. After looking through it, the FirePro M6000 was what I decided on. Especially after I found this one on eBay for $22, including tax, which was the cheapest one available. This card has slightly better performance than the GTX 765M, another popular card for these iMacs, while also being a third of the price. The only caveat is that you have to do some preparations before installing it, so it may not be the best for systems with a dead GPU. For the 2011 iMac, I want to use the WX4150 as it doesn't break the bank but still has great performance. But these things are so rare in MXM format, I might not be able to get one. Other options are the WX4170 and the WX7100, the latter of which would be awesome by the way. But those are even rarer to come by. Because those are so hard to find, I decided to split this project into two parts, with the first part focusing on the 2009 iMac. Anyway, let's get on to the upgrades. I bought 16GB of RAM for $20 and this 512GB Team Group SSD for $30. I know it's a DRAM-less SSD, but the cheapest DRAM SSD I could find is the Crucial MX500, which is double the price, and for this old thing, it doesn't make any sense to spend that money, when realistically, it won't make any difference. Maybe I should do a video on DRAM versus DRAM-less SSDs, but I digress. To start this upgrade, I first have to do a special install of OpenCore Legacy Patcher. If you don't know what this is, it's essentially a spiritual successor to DOS Dude's Patchers, as it has the ability to install newer versions of macOS on unsupported hardware, but with extra features like enabling hardware acceleration for GPUs. There are several ways to do this, but for me, I'm going to break up my 2008 MacBook and build the installer that way. In order to do this, run OpenCore, link in the description, click on Settings, and set the target model to the corresponding iMac. For me, it's the iMac 10,1. Then go to the Advanced tab, in Graphics Override, select the AMD GCN option, and build OpenCore and install it to your USB flash drive. In my case, I'm going to be ambitious and try to install Sonoma, but I'd probably recommend installing Monterey instead. Now that the parts have arrived, let's start. In order to replace the GPU, I need to take the logic board out. Well, actually, you don't really need to do this, but I want to repaste the CPU, so it needs to come out. In order to do this, you need to first take the display off, which is not that hard, it's just 8 screws. But be careful when unplugging the connectors as they can easily rip off. Then disconnect everything from the motherboard. There are some connectors on the back, so you'll need to interrupt this process in order to remove all the screws. There are some hidden ones that you'll need to worry about, like this one underneath this mess of connectors on the right side. Then, in order to make it easier on yourself, remove the power supply. But be careful, because this has exposed traces which can and will shock you if you're not careful. I don't really know why Apple left these completely exposed. After some wiggling trying to get the motherboard out, I realized I left the IR sensor in place, so be sure to take that out. After that, the motherboard should just slide out of the case, where I could do some work on it, but not before disconnecting the power and SATA connectors from the back. First, I want to repaste the CPU, so I had to get a giant screwdriver to undo these screws on the back. But then, I realized that there are 4 Torx screws on the other side that need to be undone as well. I later found out that you don't even need to touch the giant Phillips screws because they just act as threads for the Torx screws. Oh well. Undoing these Torx screws, as well as the one on the other side of the heatsink, allows this metal bracket to be removed. Once that's done, the motherboard can be lifted away to reveal the CPU. Now, I do have an E8600 in another PC, but I figured since the performance difference isn't really that much, it wasn't worth robbing the CPU out of that machine. I wish Apple would allow you to put Core 2 quads in these things. After cleaning the CPU and heatsink with a towel and alcohol, I went and took the GPU assembly off. This was mostly the same process as the CPU. I opened the package that contained the new GPU, and after cleaning it, I test fit it on the heatsink. The 2009 10,1 iMacs use an MXM-A slot for their graphics, and because of that, they have a smaller heatsink. However, because this is an MXM-B card, I need to modify my heatsink differently than what the Mac Rumors forum showed. This process took a while, but finally I could fit the GPU on the heatsink and put it all back together again. But not before putting thermal paste on the CPU. While you watch me put it back together, can I rant for a bit? When looking for compatible GPUs for these unibody iMacs, what I found was that the NVIDIA GPUs are so incredibly overpriced that they are not even worth buying to put in these anymore. Like, look at this, a GTX 770M for over $100, when regular PC GTX 770s go for around half that. This WX 3200 performs better than the GTX 770M, and goes for almost a third of the price. Why must people charge so much money for these things? I blame Luke Miani. Now that it's all put back together, I press the power button and nothing except fan spin. I put the original card back in without the heatsink and it booted up just fine. Did I get a dead card? While I had the old card installed, I decided to install macOS Sonoma onto the iMac and did all the OpenCore stuff. Alright, so I have the iMac hooked up to an external display with USB and VGA. And then that display has the keyboard and mouse plugged in. We're going to see, finally, if this works. And I have the original card in here, so I can install OpenCore and stuff on it. For some reason, the other card is not booting. And I looked on the forum, and it might just be a hardware problem, like the card itself, or a BIOS problem. I ordered a chip clip. When that arrives, we'll see. They also said that this heatsink is too small, but who cares? It'll be fine. Hopefully this works. I decided to put the heatsink back on, but since the display is not connected, the fans are running at full blast. And yeah, it's booting up. Hopefully this should be done soon. The next day, the chip clip arrived. So I took the M6000 back out of the iMac and hooked it up to the chip clip. After downloading the correct BIOS, and doing some annoying modifications to the programmer board, I could finally plug it into my 2008 MacBook. In order to flash the BIOS to the card, you have to have Homebrew installed and use it to install Flash ROM, the BIOS flashing utility. Once that's done, I backed up the original ROM twice, then flashed the new BIOS to the BIOS chip. But when I put the card back into the iMac, I got nothing. So I ordered a new card from a different eBay seller. Flashed the BIOS again, put the card on the heatsink assembly, made sure to transfer the thermal pads, redid the root patches in OpenCore, and booted it up, and it worked. All I needed to do was to install the RAM, and it was set to run some benchmarks. In Geekbench 6 CPU, it scored 391 single-core and 651 multi-core, which is terrible. My 2015 iPad Pro demolished it. In the GPU benchmarks, however, it scored 10,323 in OpenCL and 13,727 in Metal, which runs circles around the 2015 iPad Pro's GPU. Next, I tried Terraria, which was playable, probably reaching 30 to 40 FPS, but for some reason the Steam FPS counter wasn't working, so I don't really know the actual frame rate. Since the rest of my Steam library is mostly CPU bottleneck titles, I decided to jump to the list of emulators I wanted to try. First was Dolphin, and I decided to set the resolution to 1440p because damn it, I paid for all those pixels. I also made sure to check the GPU texture decoding option to free up CPU resources. Anyway, Pikmin Wars, great ROM hack by the way, ran great with no problems, except for the fact that controlling this game with the keyboard isn't really the easiest thing in the world. I then tried Colossal Caverns, and it ran pretty terribly, which is completely expected. Not even the 2006 Mac Pro could run it. I then tried Pikmin for the Wii, and it ran okay. It would hit 30 FPS most of the time, but the lows got as low as 22 FPS, which could slow the game down a lot. The next game I tried was Pokemon Black 2 and Desmume, which ran pretty much the same as on the 2006 Mac Pro, unsurprisingly. Desmume must not be optimized well at all, because in theory these machines should be handling DS games just fine. Next, I tried Ship of Harkanian, and it ran amazingly, hitting 60 FPS in Kakiri Forest and during all of the cutscenes. Now I know from experience that Hyrule Field likes to lag on older systems, so your mileage may vary. I then ran Unigine Heaven, which is actually as old as this machine, so naturally it should go pretty well, right? Wrong, it only scored 169 with an average FPS of 6.7. I'm willing to bet that this was mostly due to the OpenGL renderer, and if it were to use Metal, it would probably perform better. Lastly, I tried probably the stupidest benchmark known to man. I wrote a little C code that essentially counted up from 0 to a power of 10 selected by the user and timed how long it took. I had the machine count up to 10 billion and it took 19.165 seconds. I really have no idea what the significance of this is, but the source code will be linked in the description if you want to try it yourself. Well, that's all I have for this video. This project was definitely more in-depth than I thought going into it. The end result turned out to be worth it though, as this iMac will probably live somewhere in my house before I sell it to somebody. All in, I spent $45 for the base iMac, $27 for the GPU, $21 for the RAM, and $30 for the SSD. I guess you could also include the $11 I spent on that chip clip and programmer, but even including that, I only spent around $134, which is honestly more than I expected. But I still think it was worth it, because these machines usually go for around $125 without any of the upgrades I did. I just wish it was the 11,1 version, because that model supports 1st gen Core, so I could put a quad-core i7 in it. I will make a part 2 where I do similar upgrades to the 2011 iMac, but because of the scarcity of parts, I have no idea when that video will go up. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will see you all next time.